Some countries never recover from war. They just learn to live smaller. If the Ukraine-Russia war ended today, their populations might never look the same again. In the last century alone, wars have erased millions of lives, redrawn borders, and reshaped the future of entire nations. But the real cost of war isn't only counted in graves, it's counted in empty schools, missing generations, and babies that are never born. So, today, we're asking a chilling question. If the Ukraine-Russia war ended, how long would it actually take for populations to recover? And would they ever truly bounce back at all? To understand that, we need to look backward before we look forward. Let's begin in 1945. Europe is shattered. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Dresden look like open-air graveyards. Skeletal buildings, streets of rubble, entire neighbourhoods erased from existence. World War II killed somewhere between 60 and 85 million people worldwide. In some European countries, 10 to 20% of the entire population vanished in just a few years. Let's pause on that. That's not just a statistic. That's millions of parents, children, workers, soldiers, doctors, artists, and future leaders gone forever. But here's the part that most people miss. The true demographic damage wasn't only the dead, it was the missing future. Millions of young men never returned home. Millions of women became widows. Entire family lines disappeared overnight. Germany didn't simply recover after the war. It had to climb out of a demographic crater. It took roughly 25 to 30 years just to return to the pre-war population levels. And even then, the country was permanently changed. Fewer men, fractured families, and trauma embedded into society. Now jump to Vietnam. The Vietnam War dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Between 2 and 3 million Vietnamese civilians and soldiers were killed. When the war ended in 1975, Vietnam didn't experience an instant baby boom or clean recovery. Instead, the country entered decades of economic struggle, political isolation, and mass migration. Millions fled as refugees to the US, Australia, and Europe, and those who stayed faced poverty and instability. Vietnam's total population eventually recovered in about 20 to 30 years, but the structure of the nation, its workforce, leadership, and intellectual class was forever altered. And then there's Syria. The Syrian civil war didn't just kill hundreds of thousands, it displaced over 12 million people, about half of the country's entire population. Even today, more than a decade later, Syria is still fractured. Cities lie in ruins, infrastructure is devastated, and millions remain abroad. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many of those refugees will never return. What this means is Syria may never fully repopulate to what it once was. Not because people died, but because they left and built lives elsewhere. Across all of these examples, one brutal pattern emerges. Wars don't just reduce population temporarily, they can shrink a nation's population permanently. Ukraine and Russia. Now, let's bring this to today. Since 2022, the Ukraine-Russia war has created one of the largest humanitarian crises in modern history. Millions of Ukrainians have fled to Poland, Germany, the UK, and beyond. Tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Entire cities like Mariupol have been reduced to rubble. But Ukraine's demographic crisis didn't just start with this war. It was already underway. Even before the invasion, Ukraine had one of the lowest fertility rates in the world, between 0.9 to 1.0 births per woman. To keep a population stable without immigration, a country needs over 2.1 children per woman. Ukraine wasn't close. This means even in perfect peace, Ukraine was already shrinking. In simple terms, the war didn't create Ukraine's demographic problem, it poured gasoline on it. Once the war began, birth rates fell even further. Millions fled. Young men were drafted, injured, or even killed. Families were split across borders. So, Ukraine hadn't just lost people, it had lost potential parents, workers, innovators, and leaders of the future. Russia faces a different but equally serious problem. Before the invasion, Russia's fertility rate was only around 1.4 births per woman. Higher than Ukraine, but still below replacement rate. Since the war began, hundreds of thousands of young men have either died, been wounded, or fled to avoid conscription. At the same time, many skilled professionals, engineers, tech workers, doctors, they've all left the country. So both nations, from opposite sides of the conflict, are headed towards the same reality. Fewer young people, fewer babies, fewer futures. What actually determines recovery? To understand whether these countries can rebound, we need to have a look at what truly drives population recovery after war. There are 5 major forces. Number 1, death toll. Obviously, the more people killed, the harder recovery becomes. But what matters most is who is lost. If mostly young men die, future families disappear. If doctors, engineers, and teachers leave or die, an entire society loses its backbone. 2. Refugees and migration. Wars don't just kill people, they scatter populations across the globe. Ukraine has seen millions settle permanently in other European countries. Some will return, but many won't. Once people rebuild their lives abroad, new jobs, schools, relationships, going back to a destroyed homeland becomes emotionally and practically difficult. Every refugee who stays abroad is another family that won't help rebuild Ukraine's population. 3. Birth rates. This is where the numbers become critical. During the war, birth rates usually collapse. People are displaced, scared, grieving, or struggling to survive. Not exactly ideal conditions for starting families. Even after the war ends, trauma and economic stability can help keep fertility rates low for decades. For Ukraine, this is especially dangerous because, as mentioned before, its birth rate was already among the lowest in the world. So even if peace returned tomorrow, Ukraine would still face a massive demographic uphill battle. And here's the kicker. With fertility rate already being under 1 child per woman, Ukraine cannot repopulate itself through births alone. Any recovery would depend on refugees returning, economic rebuilding, and potentially immigration. Otherwise, Ukraine could become permanently smaller. 4. Economic recovery. If a country's economy is destroyed, young people leave, birth rate drops even further. If the birth rate drops, the population shrinks even more. It becomes a downward spiral that is incredibly hard to reverse. And lastly, 5. Trauma. War leaves deep psychological scars. PTSD, grief, broken families. Traumatized societies don't bounce back overnight, and that affects everything from relationships to fertility rates, and even morale. Imagine, no more fighting, no more missiles, peace agreement is signed. What happens next? Let's look at the best case versus worst case scenario for each country. Ukraine, best case scenario. In the best possible future, the war ends cleanly and permanently. Ukraine begins rapid reconstruction. The economy rebounds strongly. Millions of refugees return home. Fertility rate rises from its current level to maybe 1.5 to 1.8. Ukraine even attracts some foreign workers or investment. In this scenario, Ukraine could slowly rebuild over 25 to 40 years, only roughly 1 generation. But notice something important. The recovery wouldn't come from babies alone. It would come from returning people, rebuilding, and therefore stability. Even then, Ukraine may never be exactly what it was before, but it could approach its pre-war population over time. Ukraine, worst case scenario. Now for the darker possibility. The war ends, but many refugees never return. Cities remain partially destroyed. The economy struggles. Fertility rate stays around 1, and young people keep leaving for Europe. In this scenario, Ukraine does not recover at all. Instead, it follows a path similar to Syria, permanently smaller, with millions living abroad forever. The country still exists, but as a noticeably smaller nation than it was before the war. Russia, best case scenario. For Russia, the best case scenario looks different. If peace arrives today, the fighting stops, sanctions slowly ease, the economy stabilizes, some skilled professionals return, and birth rates remain around 1.4 or slightly improve. In this scenario, Russia doesn't grow, but it stops declining as fast. Population still shrinks, but more gradually, rather than collapsing. Russia, worst case scenario. In the worst case, the war's consequences linger, young men lost in battle and never replaced, more professionals leave, birth rates stay low, the economy remains under pressure. Here, Russia faces a long-term demographic decline that could last for decades. Fewer workers, fewer taxpayers, and an aging population. Even without war, Russia would still be getting smaller. With the war losses added in, the shrinkage becomes much sharper. What this really means. So what does this all tell us? Wars don't end when the guns go silent. They echo through decades of lost lives, broken families, empty homes, and shrinking nations. History shows us that recovery is slow, painful, and sometimes incomplete. And if the Ukraine-Russia war ended today, neither country would bounce back quickly. At best, recovery would take generations. At worst, both nations could permanently be smaller than before. Because population isn't just a number on a chart, it represents people, dreams, and futures that can never be replaced. Hey, I thought I'd just jump right in. If you're liking today's content and you want to see more, please consider liking and subscribing.